Very good evening, esteemed faculty for today, CA Manthan Kokhani, Chairman Ahmedabad Branch CA Harit Dhariwal, Chairman of Direct Tax Committee and Treasurer CA Sunil Sanghvi, senior members and my dear friends. Welcome to this unique session on income tax, the new provisions which has been added recently. And after listening to Manthan Kokhani at Chartered Accountant Association, we thought let him invite for Ahmedabad branch. Let's begin the session with ICI motto. I request each one of you to place your right hand on your heart for ICI motto.
Yaesha supteshu jagrati Yaesha supteshu jagrati Kamam 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 Purusho nirmimanaha Tadeva shukram Tada Brahma Tadeva mritamuchyate Tasmin lokaha shataha Sarve tadunatyati kaschan
Thank you, Shehzad Bhai. I would now request Chairman Ahmedabad Branch, CA Harit Dhariwal, to give opening remarks.
Thank you, Anjali. Respected faculty for the session, young and dynamic Manthan Kokhani, the chairman of Direct Tax and International Tax Committee, CA Sunil Sanghvi, secretary of our branch, CA Dr. Anjali Choksi. I think we are feeling like we are in a breakout room. I think before 5 minutes, we addressed another conference, parallel session on the skill development going on at Ahmedabad branch. So that session has just started and we are now in another session. That's the advantage that we have in the virtual world, wherein we can have two parallel sessions going on at the same time. So first of all, thanks to Manthan for accepting this invitation at such a short notice on a very, very important topic. And I'm sure thanks to all the participants for participating in such a large number for this very important topic. So friends, before we ask Manthan to speak, I think a few important announcements as far as the branch events are concerned. First and foremost, we are having a series on the IBC. The IBC series is going to start from tomorrow, 27th of July. And there are 7 sessions on the insolvency and bankruptcy code, and those who want to take advantage, those who would basically want to start practice in that area can start enrolling in that series. We have a grooming course on the opportune. So I think opportune series was something for the first time speakers, for those chartered accountants who wanted to speak at the platform Ahmedabad branch. We have launched this opportune series, and as promised, we are having this 21-hour grooming session. So it will be taken by the soft skills trainer. We'll be having courses on communication, on presentation, even on going mock presentation and everything. So if you want to start register for that, 3rd August we are starting that grooming course. There are 2 important national conferences coming up in the month of August. On 6th, 7th, and 8th August, we have a national conference on direct taxes. So one of the topics is going to be taken by Saurabh Suparkar sir, and we are also having someone from the Ministry of Finance join us for this national conference. And again, first ever national conference on internal audit at Ahmedabad branch. So it will be a 4-day marathon internal audit conference wherein we'll be having all the areas of internal audit covered, right from your basics to the drafting the report. We have panelists, we have CFOs of company join us. So the entire gamut of internal audit concepts will be covered. So 10th to 14th of August we have the internal audit conference, and yes, in the month of August we'll be having the series on the trust. I think it was long pending. We've always wanted to do it in a physical mode. So now since we see that the things might get better, we might have physical participation. We are planning for a series on the entire trust and the cooperative sector of the Income Tax Act as far as is concerned. We're going to do that in the month of August. So the details will be out soon. And yes, apart from this, we are having this skill development series which is going on currently. Today is a topic on the drafting. Tomorrow is a topic on the how to basically draft your invitation letters. And after this drafting, we have 3 other pillars of the skill development, that is digital pillar, communication, and personal development. So wonderful, I think wonderful design series on the skill development. So those who they want to take part in that, you can still enroll for that series. Yes, apart from these, I think a lot of events will be happening here and there, like the sessions on today's session on income tax. We have a few sessions on GST as well planned up. So whatever your suggestions, please do let us know. We'll be taking it in the utmost sincerity. And once again, I think since there are members here, I would like to inform that yes, on Saturday we had this mega mass distribution drive, wherein more than 300 volunteers, they had spread across 20 plus locations of Ahmedabad, and we had distributed 15,000 plus masks to all the people of citizens of Ahmedabad. And more importantly, we had spread the message. Our aim was not only distribution; it was basically getting the awareness of wearing masks. So these kind of social initiatives are also taken at our branch. And any suggestion that you have, any representation that you want us to make at the Delhi level, at the ICI Delhi level, please do let us know. We'll be more than happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, for the important updates and guidance. I'm sure under your able leadership, Ahmedabad branch of ICI will keep taking such initiatives. With these words, I would now request CA Sunil Sanghvi to introduce the young and dynamic faculty for today, CA Manthan Kokani, and take the session ahead.
Thank you. Chairman CA Haritbhai Dhariwal, Secretary CA Anjaliben Choksi, today's faculty CA Manthan Kokani, and all participants. Today's faculty is going to discuss on the new inserted section 45.4 regarding the capital gains. He has prepared a very nice presentation, and recently he has delivered the lecture in the CA Association also. Mr. Manthan Kokani is a fellow member of our institute. He endeavors to dedicate himself and excel in profession, particularly in the area of the domestic taxation. His knowledge of the income tax to handle problems relating to direct tax matters. He has secured 8th rank in India at the final examination conducted by the ICI. He has also secured in the board exams also the 9th rank in the Gujarat. He has fine domination over the drafting of the income tax appeal and has an excellent grasp over interpreting the direct tax laws and applying the principles of the accounting standards to help resolve the queries of the client. I know him personally. During the last year, as it was COVID, he was not on a platform. But I remember last year, Mr. Manthan has taken the lecture in physical mode at the Santinath Hall. He has been member of the various committee of the WRC of ICI as well as the Ahmedabad branch of our institute. He has also been the deputy convener of the Ahmedabad of the Assam Road Study Circle of the ICI. With this brief note, I welcome you, Manthan. And now I would request to start the session. And let's have a big round of applause. Yes, the chairman is clapping. All of us, all participants, I would request to have the big round of applause from him. And now I would request Manthan to start.
I think before Manthan speaks, I just want to tell all of you to please switch on your cameras. We have a gathering of around 40 people. We can have it kind of a study circle meeting. Please switch on your cameras. Let us have a more interactive session today.
Yes. And last 10-15 minutes, we'll be having the question answer session also on this topic. And you can raise your query, you can write your query in the chat box. We will attend them. And yes, over to Manthan now.
Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes.
And the screen is visible, right?
Perfect. You may
okay. Go. Yes. So, good evening, friends. Thank you, Chairman, sir, for such kind words. Harit bhai, Anjali Ben, Sunil bhai. The topic that we'll be discussing today, section 45, subsection 4 and section 9B are much celebrated topics of the Income Tax Act. Right before their insertion by Finance Act 1987, there have been series of litigation on these very topics, right from Mohan Bhai, Pama Bhai to Malabar Fisheries, etc. And even after its insertion by Finance Act 1987, the litigation hasn't stopped. And even there are very recent decisions like Karnataka High Court's decision of Dynamic Enterprise or Guru Nath Talkies, which I'm sure all of you must have used somewhere in your day-to-day practice. So before we start, today the Income Tax Act has become a national disgrace. There is no instance in the entire Indian jurisprudence of the Act which has been mutilated by more than 3,300 amendments. Year after year, the Finance Bill continues the fatuous tradition of introducing experimental provisions, some of which are truly whimsical, and most of which need an amendment within a short span of time. The problem is we legislate first and think afterwards. There are sections which are introduced which never come into force because they are repealed or substituted even before they see the light of the day. And the tragedy of our country is a tragedy of waste. The waste of national time, energy, and manpower. Tens of millions of man hours crammed with intelligence and knowledge are squandered every year, grappling with the torrential sweat of mindless amendments. Let me be clear, these are not my words. These are the words of great Sri Nani Palkhiwala. But those words, even when uttered 30 years back, still hold the ground today. Because when you look at the scheme of section 45(4) when it was introduced by Finance Bill 2021, what the legislature had sought was a resurfacing of an entire 45(4) and an introduction of a new section 45(4)(a). By the time the Finance Bill went to the floor of the House to be passed as a Finance Act, the new section that was introduced by the Finance Bill, before it was born, the section was made redundant, and a new section altogether, section 9B, was brought to the statute book. This is how, unfortunately, legislature is handling the tax matters at present. You would be surprised that even in the Finance Act that was passed by the Parliament, in section 45 subsection 4, there was a technical error which was subsequently amended by way of a corrigendum. To what extent that corrigendum is legally valid, only the courts will tell. But that is the sad state of affairs that we are dealing with. Nonetheless, since the provisions have already been on the statute book, all we can do is to waste our time, not actually waste our time, but deliberate on the provisions which have been brought in undue haste. And therefore, rather than interpreting the literal section that has been brought, there are several other issues or several offshoot issues which arise from the provisions and which we need to answer or probably deliberate upon, and probably even more wait for the courts to settle those particular issues. Before we discuss the amendments, let us first discuss the pre-amendment era. What is the cardinal principle of taxation for firms was governed by section 4 of the Indian Partnership Act. The Partnership Act, as we all know, said that the partnership is a relationship between the persons who have agreed to share the profits, and therefore the firm and the partners are one and the same. Partners are nothing but a collection of several persons who have come together and who join for a business to share the profits. And therefore, the courts have time and again held that when an asset is transferred from the firm to the partner or the partner to the firm, there is no transfer involved within the meaning of section 2 subsection 47 of the Act. And therefore, there is no possibility of capital gains. This was so held even by the Supreme Court in the case of Mohanbai Pamabai and Malabar Fisheries. There are several legal decisions which support this particular view. See, Malabar Fisheries, even the Supreme Court noted that consequence of distribution of asset is nothing but a mutual adjustment of rights between the partners, and there is no question of extinguishment of the right in the partnership assets. Therefore, the question of transfer does not arise. What happened was, in order to evade tax, people started to use firm as a conduit. Let's say if a person wanted to transfer capital asset to a several other set of persons, what they would do was form a partnership firm, introduce them as a partners, and thereby retire from the existing partnership firm. This resulted into transfer of assets without anyone paying the capital gain tax. And therefore, by Finance Act 1987, as an anti-abuse measure, section 45 subsection 3 and section 45 subsection 4 was introduced. What did 45(3) say? It said when a partner brought assets to the partnership firm, it shall be treated or it shall be deemed to be transfer, since it was otherwise not held as a transfer. It was deemed as a transfer. and whatever was a value that was recorded in the books of the partnership firm was deemed to be the full value of consideration. Similarly, section 45 subsection 4 provided for taxability when a firm transferred the assets to the partner. In that case, whatever was the fair market value on the date of transfer was deemed to be my full value of consideration. That was a position that continued right from 1987 till 2021. Now, why the amendment was brought, or what were the issues that required an amendment to the present provisions? The first point was the language that was used in the earlier 45 subsection 4. The earlier provision said when the firm transfers the asset, when the firm transfers the asset to the partner, whether on dissolution or otherwise, 45(4) will get attracted. The litigation started as to whether the term otherwise included retirement. There are several decisions, including the foremost decision in the case of A. Naik and Associates, which said otherwise included retirement. However, in order to make the position clear, they have now amended the provisions and substituted this otherwise or dissolution with simple reconstitution, and which has been exhaustively defined in the Act itself. Second issue which they wanted to address was taking over of money or capital asset by the partner which is in excess of his capital account balance. There were decisions of the court which said when a partner is given any money or capital asset at the time of reconstitution, it is only working out of his right. Even if the amount is in excess, there is no question of relinquishment of any right whatsoever, and therefore it should not be subjected to capital gain. In order to overturn all these decisions, now they have amended section 45 subsection 4 to specifically deem that when partner is given any money or property which exceeds the capital balance, then that excess needs to be taxed. Third issue was, at present, section 45(4) dealt only with the capital assets. Now, if a partner was given any stock at the time of retirement or dissolution, it was out of the purview of 45(4). And therefore, now when the sections are reintroduced, they have extended the scope even to stock in trade. And lastly, was a situation that was dealt exhaustively by the Karnataka High Court in the case of Dynamic Enterprises. It was a full bench decision, wherein at the time of reconstitution, the goodwill was generated in the books of accounts. The new partners brought in cash equivalent to the same, and the existing partners went away with that particular cash. The Karnataka High Court said such transaction is only working out of the right or settlement of the rights. There is no transfer as per 45(4), since money is given to the partner, and therefore it is outside the purview of tax. So in order to address all the issues or possibly tax such transactions, sections 45(4) is sought to be amended along with the insertion of a new section, section 9B. Even if you look at the explanatory memorandum, it says exactly the same, that it was introduced to address the uncertainty about the applicability of the provisions to a situation where the assets are revalued or self-generated goodwill is recorded in the books and payment is made in the excess of the capital balance. This is exactly done to overturn that Karnataka High Court full bench decision of Dynamic Enterprises. When you look at the present scheme of 9B and 45(4), let me very briefly deal with both these sections. Section 9B says, we'll deal in great detail at a later stage, but just for understanding purpose, section 9B says when a partner receives any capital asset or stock in trade from the partnership firm in connection with the reconstitution or dissolution of the partnership firm, it shall be deemed that the partnership firm has transferred that capital asset or stock in trade to the partner. And what does 45(4) says? 45(4) says when money or capital asset is given to a partner that is in excess of the capital balance, then whatever is the excess amount that is taxed in the hands of the partnership firm. To understand it briefly, the law seems there are two transactions that are involved. First is from the point of view of the partnership firm. When a partnership firm transfers the asset to the partner, obviously there is a transfer of the asset. Forget Mohan Bhai, Pama Bhai for a moment. There is a transfer or there is a change of hands. If you treat a firm as a separate legal entity like a company, there is a transfer of asset or change of hands from the firm to the partner, and therefore capital gain shall be charged. That is what is the essence of section 9B. Now, from the point of view of the partner, when a partner has invested a sum in a partnership firm, and if at the time of retirement, after all the adjustments and considering the value of the assets, if the amount that needs to be paid to him is in excess of what he has invested, that amount, in a sense, may amount to a relinquishment of the right in the partnership firm. Since he retires, his existing share is being given to some other partners, and in consideration of the same, he is receiving any money or capital asset. So whatever is the difference between the amount that he is receiving and the balance that he had already invested has to be taxed as a capital gain. The only thing is, even though speaking from the point of view of the department, even if this transaction is considered as taxable, it would be the gain of the partner and not the firm. But what the legislature has done is to treat a single collection point by mode of a partnership firm. So similar to what we have in GST as a reverse charge mechanism, in this case, even though the gain is of the partner, so to say, the tax is to be paid by the partnership firm only. Before we go to the literal interpretation of both the sections, it is important to understand from when these sections are applicable. Even if you remember the budget speech or the maiden budget speech of late Sri Arun Jaitley in 2014, the year in which they were elected, he said the government does not intend for any retrospective legislation in the future times to come in order to boost the investor and the taxpayer confidence. But if you look at the past two or three budgets, 70 to 80% of the provisions have been brought to the statute book on a retroactive basis, so to say, from the first day of the previous year in which the budget is presented, which is contrary to the general provision which says the law that would be applicable, the law of the budget that is presented by the budget would be applicable from the immediately succeeding financial year. As far as 45(4) and 9B are concerned, both these amended provisions were never a part of the finance bill, and both of them have been introduced at the enactment stage when the finance bill was presented to the floor of the parliament, and therefore there is no effective date that is provided in the finance bill. But if you look at section 1 subsection 2 of the Finance Act, it says unless otherwise provided, section 2 to section 88 shall come into force from the first day of April 2021, and therefore both these provisions are applicable from 1st of April 2021, that is assessment year 2021. So imagine a situation where the partnership firms have, based on the judgments of several high courts and Supreme Courts, have adjusted their matters right from the 1st of April till the date the budget was presented. All such adjustments, even after considering the decisions of the high courts or Supreme Courts, are now nullified, in a sense that these provisions are retrospectively applicable from 1st of April. If we consider the applicability from the 1st of April, if we consider the applicability from the 1st of April 2020, a question arises, what would be my liability for interest on advance tax? Since the transactions would have already taken place in, let's say, May 2020, at that particular point in time, this transaction would have been treated as not chargeable to tax. And later on 1st of February, these provisions were brought to the statute book and it has been now made taxable. So how do I pay my advance tax liability for the past period? That is not possible. So the only thing is I would be charged interest for shortfall of the payment of advance tax. But can I be punished for a mistake which has not been made by me, or it is a result of an amendment that is made in future on a retrospective basis? There is a judgment in the case of Mitsui Industries and Arihant Industries. Both these judgments support this view that even if a law is already proposed in Lok Sabha, the SSC need not pay the installment advance tax if the installment is due before the act gets the assent of the president. And therefore, if the amount is substantial, we need to litigate the matter at a higher stage. With this, let's start first or deal with the provisions of section 45 subsection 4. 45 subsection 4 says, I will read each phrase and thereafter interpret the same so that we can get a better clarity in the matter. Notwithstanding anything contained in section 45 subsection 1, where a specified person receives any money or capital asset or both from the specified entity in connection with reconstitution of the specified entity, then the profits or gains arising from such receipt shall be chargeable as income of the specified entity under the head capital gains. So what does it say? A specified entity, I'm sure everyone knows, is a firm or a EOP BOI. Specified person is a person who is a partner or a member of the EOP BOI. So in order to attract 45(4), there has to be a specified person. There has to be a specified entity. What is the point of trigger? The specified person receives any money or capital asset or both, and that receipt is from the specified entity. And most importantly, it has to be in connection with the reconstitution of the specified entity. If all these conditions are satisfied, then whatever is the profits or gains arising from such receipt, it shall be charged as capital gains and it shall be deemed to be the income of the partnership firm in the year in which the partner receives the money or capital asset or both. Now let us understand each of the words that has been used in the section. The section is an interesting section which has two non-obstant clause. The first, notwithstanding anything contained in section 45 subsection 1. The 45 subsection 1 deals with the transfer of a capital asset. In the present case, neither there is a transfer, since firm and transfer are the same, the firm and the partner are the same, nor is there any capital asset that is being transferred. And therefore, the principle of transfer or the year of transfer have been overridden by 45 subsection 4. And therefore, 45(4) is an independent code or a separate code in itself, whereby the charge as well as the computation mechanism both are specified. Next, it says it is triggered when the partner receives money or capital asset or both. As far as money is concerned, it is simple. But if you look at the definition of capital asset, we need to go to section 2 subsection 14 of the Income Tax Act, which defines capital asset. So whatever is a capital asset for the purpose of section 214, if you transfer those assets, 45(4) gets triggered, otherwise not. So in case a firm transfers stock in trade to the partner, 45(4) will not get attracted, since stock in trade has been specifically excluded from the definition of capital asset. Even a rural agricultural land, if it is transferred by the firm to the partner, 45(4) will not get attracted. And so is the case with personal effects like jewelry, etc. Next, it says the capital asset or money should be received in connection with the reconstitution of the specified entity. Now, what is in connection with? If you look at the various decisions of the high courts or supreme courts that have interpreted the term in connection with, it says in connection with means it has to be an event that has occurred prior to, subsequent to, or consequent upon a principal event that is defined. Take up a situation where a partnership firm has 3 partners, A, B, and C. Partner A retires from the firm, and in his place, his son is introduced to the partnership firm. That happens in most of the partnership firms that are family driven. Now, upon reconstitution, the assets of the firm will be revalued and will be credited to the capital account, let's say of the son. After 3 or 4 years or 5 years or 7 years down the line, the son starts withdrawing his capital account in cash. Now, whether the provisions of 45(4) can be made applicable at that particular point in time? See, can it be said that the son is withdrawing the money that was received in connection with the reconstitution of the specified entity 7 or 8 years before? Even I am not sure about the answer, and we need to wait for the courts to decide on this particular interpretation, because the capital account would, by the end of 7 years, would have been credited with several other amounts which are not in connection with the reconstitution. And therefore, how do you segregate the capital account balance as to this is the amount that I had received on reconstitution, this is the amount that I had received on account of my own introduction of capital, etc. And whether after the end of 7 years, the assessing officer will be in a position to identify that the amount of withdrawal pertains to that particular amount that was credited on reconstitution is a question that only time will answer. Next, it says this section is applicable on reconstitution. Now, in order to avoid the controversy of A and Naik and Associates, the Act has now specifically defined the term reconstitution. Reconstitution has been defined as to when a partner is added to the partnership firm, or one or more partner retires from the partnership firm, or there is a change in the profit sharing ratio of the partners. So let's say there are 3 partners having equal share in the partnership firm, and one fine day, the share of one of the partners is increased from 33 to 50%, and the share of the remaining partner is reduced. And consequent to such change in the profit sharing ratio, if assets are transferred to the partner or money is given to the partner, then whatever is the difference between the amount given and the capital balance of the partner will be taxed under section 45 subsection 4. Now, if all these conditions are satisfied, the section has one more non-obstant clause. It says, notwithstanding to the contrary contained in any other provisions of the Act. It says, notwithstanding to the contrary contained in any other provisions. Such profits and gains shall be determined in accordance with the formula that is prescribed in the section itself. So the computation mechanism of capital gains under section 48, whereby the cost was reduced from the full value of consideration, is now overridden. And if there is a gain under 45(4), it has to be computed in accordance with this particular formula, which says A is equal to B plus C minus D, where B is the value of money that is received by the partner, C is the fair market value of the capital assets that are received by the partners, and D is a balance in the capital account at the time of reconstitution. So whatever is the excess, that will be taxed in the hands of the partner. Now, what if while computing this formula, A is negative? So the partner is paid an amount which is lesser than the capital balance in the partnership firm. Whether any such loss will be allowed, the section is very clear. It says no loss shall be allowed, and if A is negative, it shall be deemed to be 0. So while gain is taxable in the hands of the firm, losses are not allowed to the partnership firm. As far as component D of the formula is concerned, when you need to consider the capital balance of the partner in the firm at the time of reconstitution, any amount that is credited on account of revaluation of the asset or on account of generation of a self-generated goodwill or a self-generated asset, if any such credits are there, such credits have to be ignored for the purpose of this formula. Normally what happens is at the time of a reconstitution, all the assets of the firm are revalued, since the partner that is retiring would want his share in those assets which would still be remaining with the firm, but for which he has already contributed at the time of his introduction. Or maybe after, if he is retiring after, let's say, 15 years, the firm would definitely have a goodwill. And if he is retiring from the firm, that goodwill would benefit the existing partners or the remaining partners as well as the firm in the times to come. And therefore, since he had put his sweat and effort for generation of that goodwill, he would demand a share in that goodwill. And therefore, what the firm is required to do is to recast its balance sheet, whereby the assets are revalued to the current value, or a goodwill is self-generated by the firm in the books, and the proportionate share of the partner is being given at the time of his retirement. However, when we compute this formula, when we want to compute the gain under 45(4), that excess on account of revaluation or on account of goodwill has to be ignored, since otherwise the answer would always be 0. And lastly, if you read the section literally, it says D is the balance in the capital account at the time of reconstitution. Now take up a situation where a partner's capital balance at the time of reconstitution is, let's say, 1 crore. And the partnership firm, based on the revaluation of the assets, wants to give 5 crores to the partner. In a normal circumstances, if the firm pays him 5 crore in cash, the excess of 4 crore will be taxable under 45(4), applying this particular formula. But what if the firm defers the payment over a period of 5 years? Let's say in year 1, the firm pays him 1 crore. At the end of year 1, when you apply this particular formula, the answer will be 1 minus 1, that is equal to 0. For the second year, the firm again pays him 1 crore. Even for the second year, the answer will be 0, because there is no adjustment that has been prescribed in computing the value of component D. It simply says it should be the capital balance at the time of reconstitution. So in this case, my capital balance at the time of reconstitution is 1 crore, and it will remain 1 crore for the next 5 years. So if the partnership firm pays him 1 crore every year, at the end of 5 years, the partner will be paid 5 crores and there would be no tax in the hands of the firm. I'm sure this particular planning or this particular loophole will be plugged very shortly by the legislature the moment it gets to know of the same. But as of now, as I said in the beginning, when you bring a provision in undue haste, this is how the draftsman has dealt with the formula. Next issue is regarding the eligibility of deduction or exemption under 54 EC and F. Since in the present case, when a firm gives money or capital asset to the partner, it is deemed to be my capital gain. So whether the firm can claim deduction or exemption under 54 EC, see, literally interpreting the provisions of 54 EC, it is applicable when there is a transfer of a long-term capital asset. In the present case, there is no transfer. It is only deemed to be a transfer of capital asset. And therefore, the provisions of 54 EC might not be available. But if the courts, like they have in past, takes a liberal view that a deeming provision has to be taken to its logical end, and therefore once you deem a tax or once you deem a particular thing as an income in the hands of the firm, then all the consequences of the act which are otherwise available should follow to the partnership firm as well, and therefore the firm should be made eligible for the deduction under 54 EC. As far as 54F is concerned, it is available only to an individual or HUF, and therefore the question of firm claiming the same does not arise. See, in this case, the gain is ideally of the partner, but it is taxable in the hands of the firm by virtue of this particular deeming fiction. Even in that case, if the gain would have been made taxable in the hands of the partner, probably he might have claimed a deduction under 54F. But since it is now deemed that it is a gain of the partnership firm, it shall not be eligible for claiming the deduction under 54F. The next issue that arises is regarding the set-off of loss. For this year, let's say the partnership firm has a gain of rupees 1 crore under 45(4). Now, whether this gain of 1 crore can be set off against any other capital loss that the partnership firm has incurred during the particular year. Let's say the firm is trading in shares, and on trading of that shares, it has a short-term capital loss of, let's say, rupees 1.5 crores. So whether this 1 crore of capital gain under 45(4) be set off against the loss incurred on dealing in shares? To my mind, the answer is in negative, because if you look at the scheme of section 70 subsection 2 that deals with the set off of losses, it says loss under the head capital gains can be set off only against income under the head capital gains which has been computed under a similar computation mechanism. When it says under a similar computation mechanism, it most probably deals with the mechanism that has been provided in section 48. Since in the present case, the capital gain is computed as per 45(4), which provides a separate computation mechanism in itself by way of a formula, and which has a non-obstant clause to that effect, it cannot be said that it is the same computation mechanism, and therefore capital gain under 45(4) cannot be set off against any other capital loss that has incurred, that the firm has incurred in the current year. As far as inter-head set off of loss is concerned, for example, let's say a firm has a business loss of 1.5 crores in the current year and a capital gain of rupees 1 crore in the under 45(4). In that circumstances, there is no condition that is prescribed in section 71 of a similar computation mechanism, and therefore the partnership firm can set off the current year's business loss against the capital gain under 45(4). So while inter-head adjustment is being permitted, intra-head set off of loss is specifically barred. And lastly, as far as brought forward loss is concerned, again 74 uses the same terms of a similar computation mechanism. I'm sorry, 74 says loss from transfer of a short-term capital asset shall be allowed to be set off. Now, can we say there is a transfer of a capital asset in the present case? If you look at the rules that are inserted lately, Rule 8AA, it deems the gain to be from transfer of a long-term or a short-term capital asset based on a specific criteria. And therefore, once it is deemed that it is from a transfer of a short-term or a long-term capital asset, set off of loss has to be allowed. Certain other issues that arise from the language of 45(4). 45(4) creates a specific charge upon receipt of money or capital asset. See, as we saw, the concept of transfer has now been done away with. The entire charge is on receipt of a money or a capital asset. So what is termed as a receipt of a capital asset? whether a constructive credit will attract the provisions of section 45(4). For example, at the time of reconstitution, instead of actually paying the partner, the firm merely credits the account of the partner in the partnership firm. Nothing is actually paid to the partner. In that circumstances, whether 45(4) will get attracted? The answer to that question would lie in a judgment of a Supreme Court in the case of Toshiku, 125 ITR 525, where the Supreme Court says only crediting of an account does not mean that the other party has actually received the amount. Crediting the account only means that a debt has been created, and a mere book entry in the debtor's book does not constitute a payment which will discharge the debt. And therefore, it shall be termed as received only when a person has exclusive or full control over the same. And in those circumstances, when the partner actually withdraws that capital balance, the provisions of section 45(4) can be triggered. So if only a partner's account is credited on 31st of March 2021, let's say, and the partner withdraws the capital balance on 10th of April 2021, in that case, the provisions will apply not in 2021, but in the financial year 21-22, when the actual receipt takes place. The next issue that arises is the provisions have been made applicable from 1st day of April 2020. Now take a situation where a firm is reconstituted on 31st of March 2020, and the firm transfers the assets or capital assets to the partner, but they are not actually received by the partner on 31st of March. They are actually received by him, let's say, on 1st of April 2020. In that case, whether the provisions of 45(4) would be applicable? So literally interpreting the provisions of the section, since the receipt takes place in 2021, that is on 1st of April 2020 and after, the provisions get attracted. But if you look at the provisions of the erstwhile section 45(4), those are almost in sync with the provisions of 9B, which will deal at a later stage. And therefore, on 31st of March, when there was a reconstitution, the earlier provisions of 45(4) would already be now attracted, since earlier 45(4), the charge was on transfer and not on receipt. Whereas on 1st day of April, when the partner actually receives the same, the provisions of 9B as well as 45(4) will again get attracted as per the new scheme of legislation. Now, a person or a partnership firm cannot be made subjected to two different set of legislation for the same transaction. And therefore, logically speaking, even though the receipt takes place after the date of applicability of this provision, ideally, only if the dissolution or the reconstitution as well as receipt are after 1st of April, these provisions will apply. Otherwise, if the dissolution or reconstitution is prior to 1st of April, the existing provisions will continue to remain applicable. The next issue is, which probably many of the partners or the partnership firm would have faced due to the current COVID situation, when one of the partner of the partnership firm would have died, starting from 1st of April 2020, when the provisions have become applicable. And upon their death, the partnership firm transfers the assets to the legal heir. Now, whether the legal heir can be brought within the scope of section 45(4) and thereby charge the firm on such transfer. See, if you look at the literal interpretation of 45(4), it is triggered when the firm transfers the capital asset to a specified person. And a specified person has been very specifically defined to mean a partner of the firm or a member of EOP or BOI. A legal heir is not a partner of the EOP or of the partnership firm or a member of the EOP or BOI. And therefore, if a legal heir receives any capital asset or money, the provisions of 45(4) cannot be made applicable to him. Even if you look at the provisions of 159, which deal with the provisions of legal representative of a partner in case of a death, under that provisions also, a legal heir can be made liable only for the liability which the deceased partner would have incurred. Now, in the present case, had the partner not died on 31st of March or had the partner not died after 1st of April 2020, the firm would not have been reconstituted, and had the firm not been reconstituted, the question of transfer of assets would not arise. And therefore, it cannot be said that legal heir is discharging the liability which otherwise the deceased was liable for. And therefore, any receipt by legal heir can most probably not be brought within the ambit of section 45, subsection 4. The next issue is regarding the applicability of section 50C. Whether the provisions of 50C would become applicable. 50C comes into play when an asset is transferred at a price which is less than the stamp duty value. If you look at 45 subsection 4, it says the fair market value of the asset has to be considered as the amount that is given to the partner. Now, what is the fair market value has not been defined in this particular provisions. Like we have in section 56(2)(10), that is a reference of rule 11 UA, which prescribes how to calculate my fair market value. There is no similar provisions under the present 45(4). And therefore, in order to find what is my fair market value, I need to go to the provisions of section 2, subsection 22B of the Act, which defines the term fair market value. Now, there the fair market value has been defined to mean the price at which a transaction takes place between two unrelated parties in an arm's length transaction. And therefore, if based on a valuer's report, if the firm is able to substantiate that even though the stamp duty value of the property is higher, but the actual amount or the actual fair market value, if you sell in an open market to an unrelated party, is much lower, the firm can definitely take the benefit of that particular provisions, since 50C are otherwise a deeming provision. And there are several or a plethora of decisions of the Supreme Court which says that one deeming fiction cannot be extended to another deeming fiction. Both 45(4) as well as 50C are deeming fictions, and therefore the fiction that is created by 50C limits to the provisions of 50C. What is the fiction that is created by 45(4) has to be restricted only to 45(4). So 50C cannot be brought to 45(4), and therefore even if the firm transfers the asset at a price which is less than the stamp duty value, the firm cannot be asked to pay tax on the differential amount under section 50C, provided the firm is able to substantiate that the fair market value in a transaction with an unrelated party is much lesser than the stamp duty valuation. And the last issue is the section talks about the transfer of money or capital asset by the specified entity to the specified person. Now, this capital asset or the property should be a capital asset from whose point of view? From the point of view of the firm or point of view of the partner? For example, let's take a firm which is trading in jewelry or trading in bullion. For that particular firm, the bullion would be a stock in trade. But from the point of view of the partner, when he takes over that bullion is a capital asset. So when the firm transfers the bullion to the partner, can it be said that a capital asset has been transferred? The answer would be no, because the capital asset has to be looked from the point of view of the person who is transferring the asset. And therefore, since in the present case, it is a firm which is trading in bullion, so for it, it would form a part of the stock in trade. And therefore, the provisions of 45(4) will not apply. Another question is, let's say if a partner, there are 3 partners in a partnership firm and one of them dies and the remaining partners agree to continue the firm by taking over the remaining assets of the partnership firm. Can it be argued that the remaining partners have received a capital asset in form of the share of the deceased partner, and therefore the provisions of 45 subsection 4 will get attracted? Applying the earlier discussion that we just had, in my humble opinion, this would again amount to a constructive credit. There is no actual transfer of any money or property to the continuing partners. What happens is, on death of the partner, there is a settlement of rights or working out of rights or adjustment of rights of the partners, and therefore 45(4), the deeming fiction cannot be extended to such a stretch where on a mere reconstitution, it is said that the provisions of 45(4) are triggered. Now take up a situation where a depreciable asset is taken over by the partner. In that case, the newly inserted rules 8AA and 8AB have permitted the taking over of a depreciable asset and have extended the applicability of the provisions to such assets. But in that circumstances, if a partner takes over, let's say, a machinery from the books of the firm, what will be the adjustment that will be made by the firm in its income tax return? Because if you look at the scope of the adjustments under section 43, it says only the amount which is received on sale or demolition or destruction of the asset has to be reduced from the block of asset. In this particular circumstances, there is neither a sale nor a demolition or a destruction. So when the firm or when a partner takes over a depreciable asset, probably until a clause is inserted, no adjustment will have to be made by the partnership firm in the block of assets. Whether money is a capital asset? Probably not. And that is the reason they have specifically said money or capital asset in the section. So whether, as we discussed, 45(4) is applicable from the first day of April 2020. So to say, it is a retrospective amendment by Finance Act 2021. However, the rules which prescribe the mechanism of identifying the capital gain as a short-term gain or a long-term gain, that is rule 8AA, has been prescribed with effect from 2nd of July 2021. So in that circumstances, can it be argued that right from 1st of April 2020 till 1st of July 2021, there is no mechanism to identify that the capital gain is a short-term gain or a long-term gain, and therefore the computation machinery fails, and therefore BC Srinivasa Shetty of Supreme Court applies, and therefore 45(4) is not applicable at all? Probably all these arguments will not help in a day-to-day life, but in a circumstance when a transaction has already taken place before the finance bill was introduced, and there is a substantial amount of tax liability that is involved, and if at a later stage the assessing officer seeks to tax that particular capital gain, probably such arguments might be advanced, and we need to wait for the courts to rule on that particular effect. Because even if you look at section 295 that deals with the provisions of the rule, the manner in which the rules are framed, it says the rules shall be effective from the date on which they are published in the Gazette, and it can be made applicable retrospectively only if they are beneficial to the taxpayers. In the present case, there is no benefit that a taxpayer is gaining. On the other hand, it is probably losing the amount of tax on the capital gains that he has earned. And therefore, whether these rules can be made applicable retrospectively is a question only time will tell. another issue that comes is the section 45(4) deals with the transfer of a capital asset. But what if the firm transfers or assigns the debtors of the partnership firm to the partner in lieu of the capital balance? It has been specifically held in several cases that assignment of debtors is not a capital asset in itself. And therefore, in case of such assignment, probably the provisions of section 45 subsection 4 cannot be made applicable. But there is a contrary argument, or such argument might probably be made at a later stage, that when I am assigning my debtors, the partner is given, possibly by a stretch of imagination, is given money's worth, and therefore such assignment would form part of the term money within the provisions of this section, and therefore 45(4) might get applicable. All these are open-ended questions as on date, and what we can do is to identify the arguments from both the sides, and probably it might help at a later time. And what if a capital asset is transferred on dissolution? In that case, section 45(4) will not be applicable, since 9B already takes care of dissolution. So when there is a reconstitution of the firm, 9B as well as 45(4) are attracted. But if there is a dissolution of the firm, only 9B gets attracted, 45(4) is not applicable. As far as reconstitution is concerned, whether 45(4) shall become applicable if there is only an introduction of the capital asset or a withdrawal of capital asset without any change in the share or the profit sharing ratio of the firm. Or again, if there is a change in the contrary to that, if there is a change in the profit sharing ratio, but nothing is given to the partners. So even in the first circumstances, since there is only introduction or withdrawal of the capital asset, but there is neither a reconstitution nor a dissolution, in that circumstances, the provisions of neither 45(4) nor 9B gets attracted, since the charge is on transfer of the asset in connection with the reconstitution or a dissolution. Similarly, if there is only a change in the ratio, so there is a reconstitution, but nothing is given to the partners. So even in that circumstances, the provisions are not attracted, since charge gets triggered only when both these conditions are satisfied. That is, there is a reconstitution of the partnership firm, and secondly, there has to be a transfer of money or capital asset which is in excess of the capital balance of the partners. And lastly, a very technical issue, it says, what if there is a change in only the remuneration ratio and not the profit and loss sharing ratio? If you look at the language of section 45(4), it says reconstitution means when there is a change in the profit sharing ratio. Nothing is being talked about a remuneration sharing ratio. But in that case, if you look at a very old decision of the Supreme Court in the case of R.M. Chidambaram Pillai, it says remuneration to the partner is a manner of payment of the share of profit only. So if the department applies this ratio at a later time, even a change in remuneration sharing ratio coupled with a transaction of transfer of money or capital asset might be brought to the statute. But on the other hand, there is an argument to the effect that whenever there is a deeming provision inserted by the statute, it has to be interpreted strictly and only to the extent to which the fiction has been provided, and therefore it cannot extend over and above the fiction that is being sought to create. That brings us to the second set of provisions, the newly inserted section 9B. Simply put, 9B is only a replica of the existing section 45(4), only with a change that earlier 45(4) was applicable only to a capital asset. Now 9B is applicable to a capital asset as well as stock in trade. Again, the language of the section is almost similar to that of 45(4). when a specified person receives any capital asset or stock in trade. See, earlier 45.4 talked about money or capital asset. 9b talks about capital asset or stock in trade. So capital asset remains common for a transaction of 9b as well as 45.4. If there is a money involved, it will go to 45.4. If stock in trade is involved, it will go to 9b. And if capital asset is involved, both 9b and 45.4 comes into play. So where a specified person receives any capital asset or stock in trade or both from the specified entity in connection with, there's a gap, in connection with the dissolution or reconstitution of the specified entity, then the specified entity shall be deemed to have transferred the capital asset or stock in trade to the specified person, and it shall be chargeable as capital gain or income from business or profession in the year in which the asset is received by the partner. So once again, the charge has been shifted on receipt basis rather than accrual principle. And when the partner actually receives the capital asset or stock in trade, in that particular year, the charge is attracted. And in that particular year, the firm shall be deemed to have transferred the asset, and the capital gain or PGBP will have to be offered in the return of income. So as we saw in 45.4, the conditions are there has to be a specified person, there has to be a specified entity. The specified person receives capital asset, stock in trade or both. It is from the specified entity, and in connection with, most importantly, while 45.4 deals only with a reconstitution, 9b deals both with reconstitution or a dissolution. If all these conditions are satisfied, it shall be deemed that a specified entity has transferred the capital asset or stock in trade to the specified person, and upon such transfer, the partnership firm shall be taxed under the head capital gain if a capital asset is transferred, or under the head PGBP if a stock in trade is transferred. Now again, what is the amount? Because when a partnership firm transfers a capital asset to the partner, it is based on the adjustment of the rights of the partner. There is no specific amount that can be allocated to that particular transaction. And therefore, the Act deems that whatever is the fair market value of the capital asset or stock in trade, at the time of receipt of such asset, it shall be deemed to be my full value of consideration. Again, for the purpose of FMV, we need to go to 222B, and the deeming provisions of 50C or 43CA cannot have an impact. Now, as far as the charge of capital gains is concerned, the section says the capital gain shall be charged in accordance with the provisions of the Act. And therefore, if a capital asset is transferred, section 48 will get triggered along with section 45. And therefore, the computation mechanism provided in 48 will have an application whereby the full value of consideration less whatever is my index cost of acquisition in case of a long-term asset, or the actual cost of acquisition in case of a short-term asset, and whatever is the remaining amount, that shall be charged as my capital gain. If even in a case where shares are transferred, the benefit of grandfathering will be applicable under 9b, since it says capital gain has to be computed in accordance with the provisions of the Act. However, as far as stock in trade is concerned, section 9b says income from business and profession shall be computed in accordance with the provisions of the Act, similar to the language that is used in section for the purpose of capital gain. Now, for business income, if you look at the scheme of the Act, it is governed by section 28 to 44. Section 28 is a charging section which defines what are the incomes that are chargeable under that business income. Section 29 talks about deduction while computing my income from business and profession. And section 29 says, for the purpose of computing my income chargeable under section 28, the deductions under section 30 to 37 shall become applicable. So in order to claim a deduction under 30 to 37, it is imperative that it should be an income which is chargeable under section 28. Now, as far as the receipt or taxability of receipt of a stock in trade by a partner from the partnership form is concerned, it is chargeable under section 9B and not under section 28 because there is no simultaneous amendment in section 28. And therefore, can it be said that since it is not an income under 28, the provisions of 29 which are otherwise applicable to income under 28 will not become applicable. And therefore, when a stock in trade is transferred, the firm shall not be allowed any expenditure in respect of the same. To say so or to hold so would be a little harsh, and probably a liberal interpretation has to be adopted, where section 9B says that the provisions of the act will be applicable for computing my income. It has to be deemed that all the other provisions or the commercial principles would apply for calculating my income under business and profession, and therefore any expenditure or the cost of purchase of that stock in trade has to be allowed for the purpose of calculating my income under section 9B. Also, last point was regarding the legal validity of capital gain under section 9B. All these are very technical issues that I am taking, which probably only the courts have to answer, not me and you while deliberating, but it is important to understand on what parameters or what arguments can be advanced at a later stage, if at all a client faces a similar problem and we need to find a way out. See, section 2 subsection 24 of the Income Tax Act defines the term income. And in order to be chargeable as, in order to levy an income tax on my income, it has to satisfy the character of income under section 2 subsection 24. If you look at 2 subsection 24, it says capital gains under section 45 shall be treated as my income. If you look at the provisions of 9B, it says income under capital gain shall be computed in accordance with the provisions of the Act. But there is no simultaneous amendment in section 45, which deems such capital gains to be my income under section 45 and therefore covered by section 2 subsection 24. The capital gain that is arising to the partnership firm is a capital gain under section 9B, which is not included in the definition of income under section 2 subsection 24. As far as business income is concerned, section 224 says income shall be treated as an income. It does not say profits and gains under section 28 shall be treated as income. And therefore, business income under 9B will get covered under section 224. But as far as capital gains is concerned, since it is not specified or specifically mentioned in 224, probably an argument can be made wherein the income under 9B fails the charge of the income under section 224 and thereby failing the provisions of 9B. The issues that we discussed for section 45(4) are almost similar, or almost remain same even for section 9B. And therefore, in order to avoid duplication, we'll deal with only the other issues that are specifically covered only by 9B. The first issue is, let's say a partner of a partnership firm retires, and upon the reconstitution, the entire running business of the partnership firm is given to the partner who is retiring. Can it be said that the firm has transferred a capital asset to the partner and thereby attracting the provisions of section 9B? I mean, not on retirement, probably on dissolution. If you look at the decisions of the Supreme Court, foremost JK Trust 32 ITR 535, very old decision. The Supreme Court has ruled that a running business is also a capital asset. And therefore, on a dissolution, if the partnership if the business of the partnership firm is taken over by the partner, probably it can be argued that it is takeover of a capital asset by the partner. We need to identify the fair market value of the business on the date of takeover, and thereafter compute my gain under 9B, because considering the ratio of this decision, such transactions would specifically be covered under section 9B. Now, what we discussed so far was regarding the transactions of transfer from the partnership firm to the partner, and which is taxable under the capital gain or PGBP as the case may be. Now, how to deal with a situation where the partner subsequently transfers that particular capital asset or stock in trade? In that circumstances, how would my capital gain be computed in the hands of the partner, and what would be my cost of acquisition? See, ideally, for a specified person, there is no clarity in the act as far on this particular issue. But in the example or the illustration that the CBDT has brought out by way of a guideline, there they have specified that for the partner, whatever is the amount on which the specified entity has been subjected to tax, that will be treated as my cost of acquisition. Even logically, that would be the principle that would be applicable. So if at the time of reconstitution, the specified person or the specified entity, that is the partnership firm, is taxed on the fair market value of the asset, when the partner subsequently sells that particular asset, his cost of acquisition would be equal to the fair market value of the asset at the time of the reconstitution. However, let's go back to the previous slide. As we discussed, transfer of a running business is also a capital asset. Take a situation where on a dissolution, a partner takes over the running business and provisions of section 9B are applied, where the fair market value of the partnership business is calculated and tax is paid accordingly. Now, when the partner subsequently sells off that particular running business, do we apply the same principles for the purpose of calculating cost of acquisition as we just discussed, or which are even prescribed in the guidelines by the CBDT? The answer to that lies in the provisions of section 170. Section 170 deals with the succession of a business. When a partner takes over the running business, it would definitely amount to a succession under section 170. And if it is a succession of 170, the provisions of 49 clause 3A shall become applicable, which says in such a circumstances, the cost will be the cost to the previous owner. So when a partner takes over the running business, at the time of reconstitution, the firm will pay tax considering the fair market value. But when the partner subsequently sells off that particular running business, his cost of acquisition will be the cost of acquisition of the original holder, that is a partnership firm, and not the fair market value on which the tax has been paid at present by the partnership firm. Also take up a situation where a firm is dissolved on, let's say, 31st of March 2021. 1 year later, the firm transfers the assets or distributes the assets to the partners actually. Whether the transaction will be taxable in 2021 or 21-22. The answer is definitely 21-22 because that is when the actual receipt takes place. But in 21-22, the firm is no more in existence because it is already dissolved on 31st of March 2021. In such a circumstances, how will the tax be paid? And whether the assessing officer can collect the tax from the dissolved entity? The answer is yes, in light of the provisions of section 189 subsection 1, which deals with the dissolution of a partnership firm. And it specifically says that a dissolved firm shall be liable for all the liabilities that it has arisen in respect of the income tax. And therefore, even though on 31st of March 2022, the firm was no more in existence and it was a dissolved firm, the assessing officer can very well assess its case as if the firm had never dissolved and therefore recover the tax from the partnership firm. A very burning issue that had arisen, or that was a talk of the town, was, is there a double taxation by introduction of these particular provisions? Because if there is a dissolution, only 9B gets attracted. But in the case of a reconstitution, both 9B as well as 45(4) are attracted. And therefore, it was suggested that there is probably a double taxation. And more particularly because the provisions of 45(4) had a separate clause which said these provisions are applicable in addition to the provisions of section 9B. And therefore, on a reconstitution, if a capital asset is given to a partner, 9B as well as 45(4) goes in parallel. And therefore, it was contended that there is a double taxation of the same income. But as we discussed earlier, we need to understand that 9B and 45(4) are from two different perspectives. 9B is from the perspective of the partnership firm. That is when the partnership firm transfers the assets. If it had otherwise transferred the asset to a third party, it would have been subjected to capital gain. So even in this case, when the partnership firm transfers the asset to the partners, the income tax department treats it as a transfer or deems it as a transfer, and therefore capital gain is payable. As far as 45(4) is concerned, it is a gain which the partner has earned when he receives anything which is in excess of his capital balance. And therefore, it is a gain from the point of view of the partner and not the firm. Only difference is the firm has been made liable for payment of tax on such capital gain of the partner. And therefore, the person liable to pay remains the same. But the items of income continue to remain different. Another issue is regarding the applicability of section 56 to 10. If a partner receives a rural agricultural land, let's say, on a reconstitution, 9B and 45(4) will not apply, as we discussed, because 9B is applicable to a capital asset and so is section 45(4). In that circumstances, can it be contended that section 56 to 10 will apply on such transfer? There are two probable arguments. First, transaction of transfer of a capital asset are deemed to be my income by virtue of a deeming fiction created by 9B and 45(4). However, as far as 56 to 10 is concerned, there is no similar deeming fiction that has been introduced in that particular provision. And therefore, while interpreting 56 to 10, again the ratio of Mohanbai, Pamabai and Malabar fisheries would continue to remain applicable, wherein the firm and partners are the same, and what is received by the partner is nothing but an amount on adjustment of the rights, and therefore there is no transfer within the meaning of section 56 to 10. Secondly, it can also be argued that 56 to 10 is applicable when there is either an inadequate consideration or no consideration. In the present case, can it be said that whatever is being received is a consideration? The answer is specifically no, because it is only my settlement of the rights in the partnership firm, and there is no consideration that is being received by me, because I'm not relinquishing anything. And the Supreme Court have held that when a partner retires, there is no relinquishment of right whatsoever. And therefore, the question of consideration does not arise, since I'm not giving up anything, and therefore 56 to 10 fails. And accordingly, neither 45(4) nor 9B nor 56 to 10 will become applicable. For transfer of unlisted shares, 45(4), as we discussed, talks about fair market value, which has to be read under section 2 subsection 22B. and therefore such amount can be lower or higher than the formula which is prescribed under Rule 11 UA. In that circumstances, neither Rule 11 UA nor 50 CA, which deems the value of the asset, will apply, since there is no transfer involved in the present circumstances. Last topic for today is section 48 subsection 48 clause 3 and the newly inserted rules, that are Rule 8 AB and Rule 8 AA. Before we interpret the provisions of the rules, because those are introduced in a very heavy and a technical language, it is important that we understand what is the idea behind these particular provisions. What is the idea in providing a cost step up under 48.3 as it is normally called. So your partner retires and he receives anything that is in excess of his capital balance. Why would a person receive anything more than the capital account? No person in this world would pay any extra penny to a person. The thing is, on a retirement, the partner would definitely want the assets of the firm to be revalued or to identify his share in the goodwill that he had contributed over the years. And therefore, because of that revaluation or the generation of a goodwill, the partner is paid an amount equivalent to his share. Now, when the partner is paid that excess, the firm is made taxable under 45(4). Let's say the firm has an asset of rupees 10, which is now valued to rupees 100, and the differential amount of 90 is, and the proportionate share of the partner is given in form of money, and the firm pays tax under 45(4). After, let's say, 5 years, the firm eventually transfers the existing asset to a third party for, let's say, rupees 120. In those circumstances, whatever was my increase in the value of the asset from 10 to rupees 100 had already been taxed under 45(4) in the year of reconstitution. And therefore, at the time of ultimate sale to the third party, what should be taxed should only be the differential amount of rupees 20. Because had these provisions not been inserted, the situation at the time of sale to the third party would be my fair value of full value of consideration 120 minus my actual cost of acquisition rupees 10, and therefore the firm would otherwise be liable to pay tax on 110, whereas the firm has already paid tax on rupees 90 under section 45(4) in the year of reconstitution. So there, in that circumstances, there would have been actual double taxation of the same income when rupees 90 is taxed in the year of reconstitution, and further 110 is again charged when that particular asset is subsequently sold. So in order to avoid this particular double tax, 48(3) have been inserted to the statute, and it says whatever is my capital gain under 45(4), that has to be attributed to the existing assets. Let's say there is a capital gain of rupees 90. I need to identify from which asset that particular 90 rupees of excess has arisen. If that asset is a short-term asset, my gain at present will be a short-term capital gain. If that is a long-term asset, my gain will be a long-term capital gain. If it is attributable to short-term as well as a long-term asset, I need to bifurcate my present capital gain in proportion of the increase in the value of asset, and accordingly, short-term as well as long-term capital gain will be charged in the current year. And whenever those respective assets are sold at a future point of time, whatever is the present capital gain that is attributable to that asset, that will be allowed as a deduction from my full value of consideration at that point in time. If you look at Rule 8 AB, it says the first clause says, when the present excess is attributable to a revaluation of the asset or generation of a self-generated goodwill, then the amount of capital gain that I'm paying at present under 45(4) has to be calculated in proportion to the increase in the value of the asset. Let's say there is a long-term, there is a land in the partnership firm's account, which is valued at ₹10. The fair market value of that is ₹100. So there is an increase of ₹90 in the value of land. Corresponding to that 90, the partner is paid his share of ₹30. So that 30 that is being taxed at present has to be attributed to that land. And I need to look at what is the nature of that land at present. Is the land short-term in nature or is it a long-term land in nature? If it is long-term, my present gain of 30 will be my long-term capital gain. If the land is a short-term asset as on the date of reconstitution, my present capital gain will be a short-term capital gain. Now, what if the gain is attributable to more than two assets? For example, if we extend this particular example, the value of land is increased from 10 to ₹100, and also self-generated goodwill of, let's say, ₹90 is added in the self-generated goodwill of ₹120 is added in the books of accounts. So whatever is the capital gain, that has to be bifurcated in proportion of the increase in the value of the assets. So while my land is increased by ₹90, there is an increase in the value of the goodwill by 120, and therefore whatever is the capital gain, that will be attributed in proportion of 90 to 120. And that proportion that relates to 90 will have the character of the land. That proportion which relates to my 120 of goodwill will have the character of goodwill. The second clause says, if the excess amount is not attributable to the revaluation of any asset, then there is no question of attribution whatsoever, because there is no excess which is attributable to an asset, and therefore when the partnership firm sells that asset in future, there will be no double taxation, and therefore the question of attribution does not arise. And lastly, it says, if the excess is attributable only to the asset which is taken over, again there is no question of attribution. For example, in the previous example, if the land is valued from 10 to ₹100 and the partner takes over the land itself, then the firm does not have any land so far in the books of accounts. So there is no question of selling that land in future, and therefore no case of double taxation in future. When the partner sells the land, you definitely be allowed a cost of acquisition which is equal to the fair market value. And therefore, since there is no double taxation, again 48(3) or Rule 8AB does not arise, and therefore no attribution is required. So the only circumstances when an attribution is required is when the excess is paid because of revaluation of the asset or generation of a self-generated goodwill. So these are the circumstances that arise, is when an amount is paid to the partnership firm and none of the assets are revalued. Again, 8AB does not arise. Only assets given to the partners are revalued. Again, 8AB does not arise. Only assets which are remaining with the firm are revalued. Then 8AB comes into picture, and so does 48(3). Or both the assets are revalued. That is, the assets which is given to the partner as well as assets remaining with the firm, both are revalued and an excess is paid to the partner. In that circumstances, the revaluation, the attribution will be limited only to the asset which is remaining with the partnership firm, and accordingly the gain will have to be calculated. A procedural requirement that is now added is regarding the furnishing of Form 5C. That is, when a partnership firm is chargeable under 45(4), and if it wants to take the benefit of cost attribution under 48(3), it has to file this particular form wherein you need to specify what is the capital asset to which I am attributing my present capital gain, and what is the difference on account of revaluation, which has to be supported by the report of a registered valuer, and that form has to be submitted before the due date under 139(1). Other issues arising from these provisions are the benefit, as we discussed, of attribution is available. If you want a cost step up in future, it is applicable only if the revaluation is based on report of the registered valuer. It cannot be the case that a partnership firm decides on its own about the value of the asset and thereby distributes money or capital asset. In those circumstances, the benefit is not available. And also, when a partnership firm revalues the asset and pays excess and also pays tax under 45(4), even then, on such revalued portion, depreciation will not be allowed. To understand this particular provisions, let us quickly go through a case study or an illustration, which probably will make things a little easier and understandable. I identified these particular steps which need to be undertaken to identify my income under 9B and 45(4). The first step is to determine your income under 9B. Thereafter, that is the full value of consideration minus my actual cost of acquisition. That is my income under 9B. Thereafter, compute the total income of the firm, including the income under 9B. Compute the tax on that total income. And whatever is the net income in the hands of the partnership firm, that has to be credited to the partner's capital account. After crediting the capital balance, whatever is the balance in the capital account, that has to be considered for computing the capital gain under 45(4). And thereafter, whatever is my capital gain under 45(4), that needs to be attributed to the existing assets if the excess is based on the revaluation of such assets or generation of a self-generated goodwill. Let us first go over with the illustration, and thereafter a last technical point we shall discuss. This is a case of a partnership firm where there are three partners A, B, C, each having a capital balance of ₹100 each. And the firm has an immovable property, assuming to be long-term in nature, ₹30, a patent, which is a short-term capital asset, section ₹45, and cash in hand of $225. Now, partner A wants to retire from the partnership firm, and upon such reconstitution, the firm revalues the land based on a report of a registered valuer and also the patent. And the land which was originally valued at ₹30 is now revalued to 45, and the patent which was originally valued at 45 is revalued to ₹60 lakhs. Also, the firm records a self-generated goodwill of ₹60 lakhs in the books of accounts. And based on such revaluation and recognition of goodwill, the firm decides to pay 75 lakhs as well as land to Mr. A. As we discussed, the step number 1 would be to calculate my capital gain under section 9B. 9B, as we discussed, applies when there is a transfer of capital asset or a stock in trade. Since in the instant case, the land is transferred, it is a capital asset. So my 45 lakhs, that is the full value of consideration or the fair market value of land, minus, assuming for the moment that the indexed cost of acquisition comes to ₹40 lakhs. So my capital gain under 9B will be 5 lakhs, on which, assuming the rate of tax to be 20%, the tax in the hands of the firm will be 1 lakh. The next step is to calculate the total income of the firm, including 9B, and thereafter crediting the partner's capital account in the respective proportion. So for the purpose of books of accounts, the profit for the firm will be 45 lakhs minus 30 lakhs, that is the actual cost of acquisition. So for the purpose of books, my income will be 15 lakhs minus what is the tax that is paid by the firm, that is 1 lakhs. So the balance of 14 lakhs is the income as per the books of accounts. Assuming the firm does not have any other income, this 14 lakhs will be distributed to the partner's capital account. And therefore, the revised capital balance of Mr. A will be my original capital balance of 100 plus whatever is my profit on deemed transfer under section 9B, that is share of Mr. A in the profit of rupees 14 lakhs. That would be rupees 4.67 lakhs, 14 divided by 3. And therefore, the capital balance at the time of reconstitution will be 104.67 lakhs. This takes us to the provisions of section 45(4). Since a capital asset as well as money are given, in 45(4) now gets attracted, and we need to apply the formula that is given. That is A, that is a capital gain, will be equal to B plus C minus D. B is the value of money that is given to the partner, 75 lakhs. C is the value of the capital asset that is being taken over, the fair market value of the capital asset as per the report of the registered valuer, 45 lakhs, minus my capital balance at the time of reconstitution, that is the original 100 lakhs, and 4.67 lakhs, that is my share on the deemed transfer under section 9B. That comes to 104.67, and therefore whatever is the balance left, that is 15.33 lakhs, that will be my income chargeable under 45(4). See, had 9B not in picture, or had we not computed the profits, the share of profit of the retiring partner under 9B, this capital balance would have to be taken at 100 lakhs. And therefore the firm would have to pay tax on 120 minus 100, that is 20 lakhs. In that circumstances, there would have been a double taxation of the same income. But by virtue of the provisions of 9B, which deems this transaction as a transfer, whatever is my share in that particular gain has to be reduced while computing my capital gain under section 45 subsection 4. Now the question comes as to whether this capital gain under 45(4) of 15 lakhs, whether it is a short-term capital gain or a long-term capital gain. For that purpose, we need to go to rule 8AA, which says this capital gain to the revaluation in the value of asset and generation of the self-generated goodwill. See, this 15.33 lakhs in the present circumstances is attributable to the increase in the value of patent by 15 lakhs and the recognition of the self-generated goodwill of 30 lakhs. As far as land is concerned, land is entirely taken over by the partner, and therefore 8AB does not arise. So the increase in the value of patent of 15 and recognition of goodwill of 30, in that proportion we need to divide the capital gain. So 15.33 into 15 upon 45. So 5.11 lakhs is a capital gain that is attributable to the patent, and the remaining 10.22 lakhs is a capital gain that is attributable to the self-generated goodwill. For identifying the nature of the capital gain, we need to look at what is the nature of the asset to which it is attributed. Since it is attributed to a patent, which is a depreciable asset, the gain would be a short-term capital gain. As far as goodwill is also concerned, it is a short-term capital asset, and therefore such gain is also a short-term capital gain. Suppose in this example, if a land would have been involved, which is staying with the partnership firm, in those circumstances, the amount that is attributable to the capital asset, which is long-term in nature, that proportion would be a long-term capital gain for the partnership firm. Now, if the patent is sold subsequently for 85 lakhs by the partnership firm, in that case, my full value of consideration 85 minus here 48.3 comes into play, where the amount which is already charged under 45.4 at the time of reconstitution shall be allowed as deduction, and therefore 5.11 shall be reduced from the full value of consideration less my actual cost of acquisition, and only the resultant balance would be subjected to tax at a future point in time. I hope the provisions of 8AA and 8AB would be clear by virtue of this illustration. Just a small question that I would like to raise, considering the language of the provisions, and then we end this session. Take up a situation where there is a partnership firm having 3 partners A, B, and C, and the partnership firm has a stock in trade of, let's say, rupees 10 crore. Assuming it is a partnership firm trading in jewelry, the fair market value of the inventory went from 10 crore to 100 crores, assuming for a moment, or let's say 10 crore to 20 crores. And at the time of retirement of Mr. A, the partnership firm identifies his share in the excess of rupees 10 crores and gives him an equivalent amount of money. For example, if the gain is 10 crores, he is given 3.33 as a money in excess of the capital balance. Now, in that circumstances, when my excess amount that is paid is attributable to my increase in the value of stock in trade, whether 9B or 45.4 apply. If you look at 9B gets attracted only if the stock in trade is transferred to the specified person. Since in the instant case money is given, 9B does not come into picture. As far as 45.4 is concerned, 45.4 talks about money, and therefore it will be covered within the scope of 45.4. If you apply the formula A is equal to B plus C minus D, whatever is the excess of rupees 3.33, that will be taxable under 45.4. But the question now arises is what will be the nature of that particular capital gain? Will it be a short-term capital gain or a long-term capital gain? Because if you look at the language that is employed by Rule 8AA, it says if the gain is attributable to an asset which is a short-term in nature, or an asset which forms part of the block of asset, or a self-generated goodwill or a self-generated asset, then such gain shall be deemed to be from transfer of a short-term capital asset. Or if the gain is attributable to an asset not covered by one and which is a long-term capital asset at the time of reconstitution, it shall be deemed to be a long-term capital asset. Had the stopped in clause number 2 at not covered by one, this would definitely fall under that particular exception. But even clause 2 says it has to be a long-term capital asset at the time of reconstitution. Now, in these circumstances, the partner is being paid money, and that money is attributable to the value of a stock in trade, which is neither a short-term capital asset nor a long-term capital asset. In that circumstances, can it be argued that Rule 8AA fails since it talks only about a capital asset and this is a stock in trade? Since Rule 8AA fails, even Rule 8AB fails. Since Rule 8AA and 8AB both fail, the gain under 45.4 is neither a short-term gain nor a long-term capital gain. And therefore, my computation machinery fails. And therefore, applying B.C. Srinivasa Shetty of Supreme Court, when money is given to the partner in excess of the capital balance and it is attributable to the increase in the value of stock, 45(4) shall not become applicable, and therefore no tax shall be leviable. I am sure the moment the real estate assessees or the bullion assessees take benefit of this particular provisions, an anti-abuse proviso will be definitely added. But till that time, this is what the literal interpretation of 45(4), 9B, 8AA, and 8AB stands as on this date. I hope within this limited time, I have done justice to explaining the provisions which are introduced by the legislation in such a hurry that there are issues that have started arising from the interpretation of the wordings of the section, and therefore a section which has been celebrated by various decisions and various landmark decisions will continue to provide an opportunity of litigation even in times to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bandhan bhai. Thank you so much. Anyone have any query? Then please put up your query. At present, there are no queries over here. Any questions? You will definitely share the PPT of Manthan bhai, so don't worry about it. I think there are no questions in the group also. Any of my friend? Yes, there is one question. In case of dissolution, fair market value will be what? And cost will be what?
In case of a dissolution, the fair market value, as we discussed, will be my fair market value as per section 2 subsection 22B. So whatever are the capital assets lying with the partnership firm or the stock in trade, it has to be valued as per 222B. That is the price it would fetch in an open market in an arm's length transaction, and that has to be considered for 9B. And cost will obviously be my actual cost of acquisition.
I would like to just inform you there is a meeting of the committee members. So Anjali Ben, Harit Bhai and Sunil sir are not here at present. They are in the meeting, so I am taking care of it. One question, Mandan bhai. In chat box.
Income tax is a personal tax. Can liability of the same be passed on the other person by deeming fiction? See, I'm sure these questions will be raised before the courts, but as of now, when they are deeming something to be my income, the legislation definitely has the power to deem anything and everything as an income. Whether this is a tax of the partner is an interpretation that we are taking at the moment. The act never provides, or it has never provided that it is actually the gain of the partner. What they are trying to tax is definitely the gain of the partner, because that was their contention even in several case laws. But explicitly nowhere it has been provided that it is a gain of a partner which is paid by the firm. So when the Income Tax Act or the legislation itself says something to be deemed as my income, I think it has to be deemed in the manner it has been provided, and we cannot argue that the tax liability has been shifted from one person to another unless it was earlier explicitly provided.
One more question, Manthan bhai.
As discussed in dissolution resolution, only 9B comes in picture. Then gain would be computed as per FMV or stock or FMV of firm, both. No. See, in case of a dissolution, if the stock in trade is transferred to the partner, the FMV of stock has to be considered. If the capital asset is transferred to the partner, FMV of capital asset has to be considered. I mean, for the other assets which are other than capital asset or stock in trade, taxability under 9B will not arise because deeming fiction will have to be restricted only to a capital asset and stock in trade. All the other assets are outside its purview. So they would continue to remain tax free.
I think many of us will definitely face, due to that, as Manthan Bhai says, due to the pandemic, many of our close ones have lost their lives and might affect their partnership. So it would be very helpful to us.
I think that's it. There are no more questions.
I think they all know. Thank Manthan Bhai, thank you so much. At a stretch, you have taken the session without any break and a very nice presentation with the your light are enlightening us in the PPT. So I'm thankful all the participants and my friends who joined for this session. And on behalf of everyone, Manthan Bhai, thank you. Thank you very much. So we all leave now. Manthan Bhai, you can leave now. There is no more question.